Hey, welcome back. So we saw in the last video how column charts can be used to visualize trending. That is to say, how our metrics change over time. Well, there's another type of chart that arguably does this even better: line charts. So in this video, we'll learn to use line charts to visualize our measures changing over time. And while we're at it, we'll also explore a special kind of slicer that's purpose-built for working with dates. Let's get started. So before we go and convert this chart into another type of chart, I want to do just a little bit of cleanup on it first. So I mentioned in the last video that our little legend over here on the right side of the chart is no longer chart junk that just takes up space in the chart without doing anything meaningful. However, we still have these filter buttons all over our chart that are quite unlikely to be used by our end user, especially when we have the option of inserting slicers outside of the chart, which are more intuitive and user-friendly. So if we want to free up some space in our chart by getting rid of those, all we have to do is right-click one of those buttons, and then choose Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. And now they all disappear, and we have a more professional-looking chart that also has a little more breathing room for the stuff that actually matters, which is our data. Now, another step we could take here is to add a title to our chart, just to clarify what its purpose is. So to do that, I'd go to our Design Contextual tab, and then hit this Add Chart element over on the left, and then hover over Chart Title, and specify Above Chart. So now we've inserted a new object into our chart, that being a chart title, and with that object there, we can customize the text however we see fit. And so I think I'll call our chart Items Sold by Product Category. And now we have a nice, clean, professional chart whose purpose is clear and doesn't have any extraneous junk or noise to distract us from the message we're trying to convey. So with this chart as our starting point, let's convert it to a line chart to see the contrast in how the line chart conveys change over time. So I'll select the chart and then go to my Design tab, change chart type, and then I'll choose line chart. And while you could certainly argue the column chart did accurately convey trending over time, the line chart does this a little more naturally by literally connecting the dots between each individual time frame on our chart, not only conveying what happened at a given point in time, but the overall trend of how things are changing over time, which is generally what we want to see in a chart that has a time component. Now, one feature you can add to a line chart that augments this capability is a trend line. So if I click one of these data series for one of our product categories, and then right-click and choose Add Trend Line, now I'm given a list of options for different trend lines that can automatically be drawn on our chart that basically smooth out the noise from individual data points into a visualization that captures the overall trend of our metric over this time frame. Now, there's lots of different options, but many of these involve some level of statistical knowledge, and this is not a math or stats course, so I'll stick with the most common and default for now, which is linear. And then turning our attention to the chart, we see this nice little trend line that captures the overall big picture trend of our beach supplies sales from the very beginning of our time frame to the end. And obviously you could continue adding trend lines for the other product categories in our chart as well, if you saw fit. So now that we've seen what line charts can do, in the same way as we looked at a variation of column charts called stacked column charts, let's look at a variation of line charts called stacked area charts. So if we go up to Change Chart Type, and then choose Area, and then choose this second option from the left called Stacked Area, and click OK, you'll see that we still get this nice sense of trending of our metric over time, but we also get a visualization of the proportionality of our different product categories to each other. So in short, A stacked area chart like this is great for conveying both trending and proportionality in your data. Now, one downside is they do not allow you to add trend lines in the way that you can with line charts. So if I select one series and try to add a trend line, you'll see that that option's grayed out. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're weighing whether to convert your chart to a line chart or a stacked area. So now that we have the right charting tool for the job of conveying trending over time, let's look at a specialized type of slicer that allows you to dynamically adjust the time frames reflected in your pivot tables and pivot charts. And that's called a timeline. Timelines are yet another feature that can give your Excel reports a dynamic dashboard style element. So let's see how they work in action. So I'll click our pivot chart here, and then go to the Pivot Chart Analyze tab, and then right next to the Insert Slicer button, we'll click this Insert Timeline button. And then the field you're going to want to use as the basis for that timeline is generally going to be the date field from your calendar table. So we'll choose that and click OK. And then drag this over to be roughly parallel with our region slicer. And we see that our timeline very much has a slicer-like interface, such that a user who's familiar with using slicers and comfortable with that interface would also quickly become comfortable using a timeline. So one bit of value that timelines add to your pivot charts is that they give you incredibly fine-grained control over the time frames reflected in your pivot charts. Now this makes it feasible to include more granular breakouts of your measure. So remember before, we tried to add month to our chart, but it ended up just being a little bit too messy because there were so many different months included across the entire time frame we were looking at. But if we now select our chart and then swap out quarter for month, at first we're kind of back to square one. But now, using our timeline, we can select incredibly specific slices of time so that our new monthly breakout makes more sense. So first I'll click this drop down that currently says months and change that to years. And then I can actually just click to select any one of these years over which we have data. And if I select 2020, for example, now I have this nice clean breakout of monthly trending just for that year. Now, what if I wanted to select multiple years? You don't have to hold down Control or Shift and then click one year or the next. Actually, if you hover over the year that's selected, you'll see that you have a handle on either side of that selected year. And if you hover over that until your cursor changes into this little horizontal arrow, you can actually drag it to select another year. And of course, we're not limited to selecting for just years. We can also select quarters or months in just the same way. So if I uncheck all of our filters, I can now choose quarters in my drop-down box, and then perhaps start with a single quarter, perhaps the first quarter of 2020, and then I can just start dragging until I get perhaps to the fourth quarter of 2021. So you can see at this point how this timeline gives us complete and dynamic control over the time frame of the data displayed in our pivot chart, essentially giving you an infinite number of pivot charts in one. The ability to condense this many potentially different views into one single chart is what dynamic reports and dynamic dashboards are all about. Now, it's worth noting that you don't even have to have a time component in your pivot chart to use a timeline as a slicer. So for example, what if I just removed the date and time component from our chart altogether? So I'll go to my field list and just remove year and month. And now I'll drag product category down into my category axis, and maybe I'll convert my chart to a bar chart. So now I have an admittedly very simple chart, but nonetheless one whose data I can dynamically vary now in multiple different ways using my two slicers. I can not only select any combination of regions I want to filter this data, I can also vary the time frame reflected in the data to be as wide or narrow as I want. So just for example, if I switch back to years, I can choose 2019 through 2021, and you'll see that the lengths of the bars change. Or I can switch to months, and then just select a few very specific months. So maybe I only want to select maybe 6 months from January 2020 through June 2020. I'll just scroll back to my very first selected month and go all the way to January 2020. And then I'll go to the end and scroll back the other way. And now my chart reflects a different time frame. And if you look at the top left corner of the timeline, you'll see that we have a helpful little caption that summarizes the timeline we've selected. Now right now, since the 6 months I've selected reflect quarters 1 and 2 of 2020, that's how the caption summarizes it. But if I were to add one more month, now it instead says January through July 2020, because that is now the most efficient way at conveying that time frame. All right, so continuing the theme of packing as much information as possible in as small an area as possible while still making our interface user-friendly and our information easy to interpret. Up next, we'll look at another type of chart, or perhaps more accurately, type of charts, that can help us crunch even more value into our limited screen real estate. I'll see you then.